"I'm sorry, sir, but we have a certain standard for our speakers tonight." The words sliced through the air like an invisible knife, designed to cut without leaving evidence. The hotel ballroom, draped in crystal chandeliers and sophisticated wealth, fell into an uncomfortable silence. James Wilson, with his modest teacher's salary reflected in his department store suit, stood frozen before the microphone that had just been denied him. 20 years of transforming children's lives reduced to not meeting the standard of this charity gala. His hands trembled slightly, the note cards containing his speech suddenly heavy as stone. The annual Children's Future Foundation Gala sparkled with wealth and influence. Tables adorned with $1,000 centerpieces, surrounded by people whose watches cost more than James's monthly salary. The event coordinator, Maxwell Reed, stood with perfect posture in his tailored Armani suit, a practiced smile barely concealing his disdain. Phones recorded the awkward moment, capturing James's public humiliation for social media consumption. Among the sea of designer dresses and custom tuxedos, a figure at table 7 watched with unusual intensity, his familiar face partially hidden behind the rim of a water glass. "Perhaps," Maxwell continued, his voice dripping with false kindness, "you could submit your thoughts in writing for next year's consideration." The dismissal was clear. James didn't belong on this stage. He nodded silently, dignity fighting against humiliation as he stepped back. What Maxwell failed to notice was how the famous figure at table 7 had set down his glass, how his expression had shifted from casual observation to focused attention. Tom Hanks straightened his bow tie and rose from his chair. The real story was about to begin. James Wilson clutched his note cards as he stepped away from the stage, each footfall echoing his rejection. 23 years of teaching in the same underfunded public school, where he'd spent thousands from his own modest salary on classroom supplies. The story he'd prepared wasn't about himself. It was about Miguel, a former student who'd overcome homelessness and was now attending Yale on scholarship. A story that belonged at a charity event supposedly dedicated to children's futures. The ballroom resumed its gentle hum of privileged conversation, crystal glasses clinking, as wealthy donors congratulated themselves on their generosity. Maxwell Reed had already moved on, introducing a celebrity chef whose restaurants charged more for a single meal than most families spent on groceries in a week. The chef launched into anecdotes about teaching cooking classes to underprivileged youth, an experience he'd had exactly once for a photo opportunity. James found his way back to the far corner table, where the teachers and actual social workers had been seated, away from the donors and celebrities. His colleagues offered sympathetic glances, but no one spoke. They all understood the hierarchy at play. They were the props, not the players, in tonight's performance of compassion. "They invited us to give the event credibility, not a voice," whispered Sarah, a social worker who'd spent 15 years in the trenches of child protective services. Her eyes reflected both understanding and bitter resignation. James nodded, his disappointment hardening into something quieter but more resolute. His thoughts drifted to Miguel, how proudly the boy would have stood to be recognized for his achievements tonight, how powerful his story might have been for these donors to hear directly. At the center tables, Maxwell floated between influential guests, his practiced charm shifting subtly to match each person's status. He lingered longest with celebrities and business moguls, offering effusive compliments and ensuring their wine glasses never emptied. When an assistant whispered something in his ear, his eyes darted to table 7 with sudden, almost predatory interest. The whispers began spreading throughout the room like ripples in still water. Heads turned discreetly toward table 7, where Tom Hanks sat in conversation with fellow guests. Unlike some celebrities who projected an aura demanding attention, Hanks carried himself with the comfortable ease of someone who had nothing to prove. His presence at the charity gala wasn't unusual. His commitment to children's causes was well documented, but the sudden focus on him seemed to shift the room's energy. Maxwell adjusted his tie and plastered on his most ingratiating smile as he approached Table 7. "Mr. Hanks, we're honored by your presence tonight. We've prepared a special acknowledgement of your contributions to our cause, and we'd be deeply grateful if you'd say a few words." The invitation, so eagerly extended to the celebrity, hung in stark contrast to James's dismissal just minutes earlier. Tom Hanks smiled politely at Maxwell, though something flickered in his eyes that suggested he'd been watching more than people realized. "That's very kind," he replied, his voice carrying that distinctive warmth that had endeared him to generations of moviegoers. "But I'm curious about something." He gestured toward the corner of the room where James sat. "I was looking forward to hearing from that gentleman. I believe his name badge said James Wilson." Maxwell's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "Ah, well, we have a very tight schedule this evening, with many distinguished speakers. I've always believed that those closest to the work have the most valuable perspectives," Hanks continued, his tone friendly but firm. Phones began emerging from pockets and purses, recording this unexpected exchange. "In fact, I'd be happy to yield my time to him. I'd much rather listen than speak tonight." Maxwell's composed facade cracked slightly, a hairline fracture in his perfect veneer of control. The ballroom had transformed in an instant, 100 faces now turned toward him, 100 expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed delight at his discomfort. The power dynamic had shifted so suddenly that he seemed physically unbalanced, rocking slightly on his Italian leather shoes. "Mr. Hanks," Maxwell recovered with practiced smoothness, lowering his voice as if sharing a confidence, though the room had grown quiet enough that many could hear. "While we appreciate Mr. Wilson's dedication, tonight's speakers were carefully selected for their ability to inspire our donors. We're raising millions for children's education tonight." "Which makes education experts particularly relevant, wouldn't you say?" Tom Hanks responded, his voice pleasant but unyielding. The friendly crinkles around his eyes didn't match the firmness in his gaze. He stood now, not dramatically but deliberately, his movement creating a ripple effect as phones rose higher to capture whatever would happen next. Across the room, James watched with a mixture of disbelief and growing hope. The teacher in him recognized a powerful, teachable moment unfolding, a lesson about voice, about who gets heard and why. Sarah nudged him gently, her earlier resignation replaced by wide-eyed anticipation. The event photographer, sensing a viral moment, began snapping photos rapidly. Light flashed off crystal and silver as Maxwell's smile grew increasingly strained. His eyes darted to the doorway where his assistant stood, silently pleading for intervention, for some magical solution to this unexpected disruption of the carefully orchestrated evening. "Of course, we value educators tremendously," Maxwell attempted, his voice carrying the artificial warmth of a telemarketer. "That's why we're raising funds tonight. But our program—" "Programs are important," Tom nodded thoughtfully. "But so are the people who turn those programs into real change. I'd really like to hear what Mr. Wilson has to say. Wouldn't all of you?" He turned to the room with such natural charisma that several people nodded automatically. A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the ballroom. Celebrities at neighboring tables, sensing the shifting social current, began nodding along. A famous director stood and raised his glass toward James's table. "To the real heroes," he called out, seizing the opportunity to align himself with what was clearly becoming the right side of this impromptu moral play. Maxwell's assistant scurried over with the printed program, pointing frantically at the timetable. Maxwell glanced at it, then at the room full of influential people watching him. His mental calculations were almost visible. the risk of offending Tom Hanks versus the disruption to his carefully planned evening. Sweat glistened at his temples despite the ballroom's perfect climate control. "Perhaps we could make a small adjustment," Maxwell conceded, his voice tight. "A brief comment from Mr. Wilson after the main program." "Actually," Tom interrupted gently but firmly, "I think now would be perfect. I was about to be introduced, wasn't I? I'd like to use that time to introduce James instead." He turned toward James and gestured warmly to the stage. The invitation wasn't just a suggestion. It was a public passing of the spotlight that would be impossible to deny without revealing the ugly inequality at play. Phones throughout the ballroom recorded everything, social media algorithms already calculating the viral potential of this unexpected confrontation between Hollywood royalty and gala elitism. A tech billionaire at Table 3 whispered something to his assistant, who began typing rapidly on her phone. The event hashtag was climbing trending lists by the second. James stood slowly, straightening his department store jacket. His colleagues at the table offered encouraging smiles, one reaching out to squeeze his arm in solidarity. The note cards in his pocket, the speech he'd prepared so carefully, suddenly seemed inadequate for this moment. His story about Miguel had become something larger, a story about who gets heard in rooms of power, about the value of lived experience over wealth and fame. The path to the stage felt both endless and immediate. James was acutely aware of hundreds of eyes following his progress. The wealthy donors, the celebrities, the hotel staff, standing against walls, watching this unexpected turn of events. Maxwell stepped reluctantly aside, his smile now a rigid mask, eyes communicating a clear warning: "Don't embarrass us." Tom Hanks met James halfway, extending his hand with genuine warmth. The contrast between the two men was striking, Hanks in his perfect custom tuxedo, James in his slightly shiny suit from 3 seasons ago, yet the actor treated him with the same respect he would a fellow Oscar winner. "I've been looking forward to hearing your story, James," Tom said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "I believe real experience counts for more than celebrity in these matters." The words were gentle, but the message was unmistakable, a public correction of the values that had led to James's earlier dismissal. They reached the stage together, Tom casually keeping his hand on James's shoulder in a gesture that communicated clear support. The microphone stood waiting, the same one that had been denied to James earlier. Maxwell hovered at the edge of the stage, his entire body tense as he calculated the potential damage to his reputation and future career prospects. A tech mogul's wife at Table 2 whispered loudly to her companion, "This is why everyone loves Tom Hanks," her voice carrying in that peculiar way that suggested she intended to be overheard. Several people nodded in agreement, social alliances shifting visibly throughout the room. The collective judgment was clear. Maxwell had misjudged badly, and Tom Hanks was, once again, America's moral compass. James took a deep breath as he approached the microphone. The note cards in his pocket contained facts about educational inequality, statistics about underfunded schools, and Miguel's remarkable journey. But standing there with Tom Hanks's supportive presence beside him, James realized he needed to speak from something more powerful than prepared notes. He needed to speak from the heart that had guided his 23 years in the classroom. The microphone stood before James like a judge awaiting testimony. The silence in the ballroom was complete now, the kind that emerges when hundreds of people collectively hold their breath. Even the servers had paused, trays of champagne suspended mid-journey. Tom Hanks stepped slightly to the side, remaining present, but ensuring James stood alone in the spotlight. "Thank you, Mr. Hanks," James began, his teacher's voice finding surprising strength in the cavernous room. "And thank you all for being here tonight to support children's education." The words were diplomatic, but his eyes briefly met Maxwell's with quiet acknowledgement of what had transpired. This wasn't about revenge. It was about something more important. "I was going to tell you about a former student of mine named Miguel," James continued, his voice growing more confident. "I had his statistics prepared, his test scores, his scholarship information, all the data points that prove his success." He pulled the note cards from his pocket, glanced at them, then deliberately set them aside on the podium. "But that's exactly the problem, isn't it? We reduce children to data points, to numbers on a spreadsheet, to underserved populations that make for good talking points at galas like this." The words weren't rehearsed, but they carried the weight of 23 years of witnessing the gap between charity galas and classroom realities. Across the ballroom, faces registered surprise, discomfort, and, from the corner tables where teachers and social workers sat, fierce approval. A famous actress at table 4 leaned forward, her expression unusually genuine beneath her perfect makeup. A tech billionaire who had been checking his phone throughout the evening finally looked up, his attention captured. James wasn't speaking with anger, but with the passionate precision of someone who had finally been given the chance to speak a long-held truth. Miguel isn't a success story because of charity galas. He's a success story because someone finally saw him as a person, not a project. "Miguel slept in his family's car for most of 7th grade," James continued, his voice steady but emotion evident in his eyes. "He did homework by streetlight and washed up in gas station bathrooms. But when he came to my classroom, he wasn't homeless student number 27. He was Miguel, brilliant at math, terrible at spelling, and determined to make his mother proud." Images appeared on the large screens flanking the stage. The foundation's staff, recognizing the moment's power, had quickly found photos from the presentation James had submitted. Miguel as a skinny 13-year-old accepting a science fair award. Miguel at 17 in a borrowed suit, holding his Yale acceptance letter. "The truth is," James said, his gaze sweeping across the room of wealth and privilege, "kids like Miguel don't need our pity. They need our respect. They need adults who see their potential, even when society has decided they have none." Tom Hanks nodded quietly from the side of the stage, his expression reflecting genuine emotion rather than performative charity. The ballroom remained utterly silent, the usual rustling of dinner programs and clinking of glasses completely absent. "I know many of you donate generously," James acknowledged, his tone free from accusation. "But tonight I'm asking for something more valuable than money. I'm asking you to see the humanity in the children your donations reach, to understand that their stories matter more than the warm feeling you get from writing checks." A woman at table 2 dabbed at her eyes with a silk napkin. A renowned filmmaker had taken out a small notebook and was writing rapidly. Maxwell stood frozen at the edge of the stage, his expression unreadable, but his assistant was furiously typing on her tablet, likely attempting damage control for what was becoming a powerful, unfiltered moment. "Miguel is now a second-year medical student," James said, his voice softening with evident pride. "Last month he told me he wants to open clinics in neighborhoods like the one he grew up in. Not because it makes for a good story at fundraisers, but because he remembers what it felt like to be invisible." James paused, looking directly at Tom Hanks with genuine gratitude before turning back to the audience. "I want to thank Mr. Hanks, not just for giving me these minutes to speak, but for demonstrating what real influence looks like. It's not about who gets invited to which stage. It's about using your voice to ensure others can use theirs." The first applause came from the tables in the corner, the teachers and social workers rising to their feet. It spread like wildfire through the ballroom, celebrities and CEOs standing almost in unison. Even Maxwell, recognizing the inevitable tide, joined with carefully calculated enthusiasm. The standing ovation washed over James like a wave, powerful enough to bring unexpected moisture to his eyes. Tom Hanks returned to center stage, clapping with genuine admiration as he approached the microphone. "Now that," he said simply, is why teachers deserve our deepest respect. He turned to James. Thank you for reminding us what tonight is really about. As the applause continued, Maxwell moved forward with the smoothness of a politician attempting to reclaim control of his event. What a powerful message, he said, his voice loud enough to be heard over the applause. This is exactly the kind of authentic perspective we value at the Children's Future Foundation. The irony of his words wasn't lost on those who had witnessed his earlier dismissal of James. Several knowing glances passed between guests, and more than a few cynical smiles appeared. But the moment had transcended Maxwell's hypocrisy. Something genuine had broken through the polished veneer of the charity gala. Something true had been spoken in a room usually reserved for comfortable half-truths. The remainder of the gala unfolded with a palpable shift in atmosphere. Conversations at the elegant tables had changed, moving beyond superficial networking to discussions about education policy and the realities faced by teachers. James found himself surrounded by guests who had previously overlooked him, celebrities asking thoughtful questions, business leaders offering cards with handwritten personal emails. Maxwell maintained his professional composure, but his assistant's frantic damage control couldn't erase what everyone had witnessed. Social media was already ablaze with video clips of Tom Hanks championing the overlooked teacher against gala elitism. Respect teachers and Tom Hanks. Being Tom were trending nationwide, with clips of James's speech rapidly accumulating millions of views. "You changed the energy in this room," Sarah whispered to James when he returned to their table, her earlier cynicism replaced by something like hope. Other teachers and social workers squeezed his arm or patted his back as he passed, their pride evident. The most significant change was happening at the donor tables. Checkbooks emerged not with the usual performance of philanthropy, but with a quieter, more thoughtful purpose. The tech billionaire who had finally paid attention was deep in conversation with his wife, both nodding seriously as they wrote what would later be revealed as the largest donation in the Foundation's history, specifically earmarked for teacher resources and classroom supplies. By the following morning, the story had transcended entertainment news to become a national conversation. Major networks played clips of the moment, splicing Tom Hanks's intervention with James's powerful speech. Education forums and teacher groups shared the video as validation of their often overlooked value. The Children's Future Foundation, recognizing opportunity in the viral moment, announced a new initiative focused on teacher support and classroom resources. Maxwell Reed gave a carefully worded interview praising James's passionate advocacy without acknowledging his earlier dismissal. The calculated omission didn't go unnoticed. Social media users quickly produced side-by-side clips showing his contradictory behavior. 3 days after the gala, James received an unexpected call. Tom Hanks was launching a new foundation focused specifically on supporting teachers in underfunded schools, and he wanted James on the advisory board. "We need authentic voices," Hanks explained simply. "People who understand the reality, not just the theory." The most meaningful aftermath came in James's classroom. Students who had seen their teacher trending online looked at him with new eyes, not because a celebrity had acknowledged him, but because they witnessed an adult they respected standing up for what he believed in, speaking truth even when it was difficult. 6 months later, James stood at a different podium. This time, he was the keynote speaker at a national education conference, addressing a room filled with teachers, administrators, and policymakers. The viral moment had transformed into something more substantial, a movement rethinking how society values educators. "The spotlight fades," James told the audience of his peers, "but what remains is what always mattered, the daily work we do in classrooms that most people will never see or applaud." In the front row sat Miguel, now in his white coat, during a break from medical school. Beside him was Tom Hanks, who had kept his word about prioritizing authentic voices in his new foundation. They represented the perfect bookends of the story: the student whose life had been changed by an educator who saw his potential, and the celebrity who had used his platform to ensure that educator could speak his truth. Our value isn't measured by viral moments or standing ovations, James concluded, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who knows his worth beyond external validation. It's measured in the lives we touch, the potential we nurture, the futures we help build one child at a time. The applause that followed wasn't as thunderous as at the gala, but it carried something more valuable: the genuine recognition of a community that truly understood the power of his words and the truth of his experience.